All right. Welcome, everyone. We're so glad you are here with us. Thank you so much. We're going to record this just so we can keep it up on the QualLab webpage. We know that sometimes people like to view this later, or you all might want to take a look at it at some point. And we are very excited to have Dr. Leslie Moore and Dr. Jackie Goodway, who are both fantastic scholars, and Bakari will give a formal introduction of them in a second. He's going to move to the housekeeping page. So my name is Penny Pasque. I am a faculty with Ed Studies and also director of the QualLab through the Office of Research, Innovation, and Collaboration. So right now we're asking just microphones and off, videos can be on or off. Either one is just fine. This is a smaller group. We kind of like it when we're all able to sit around a table in the QualLab together, but since COVID, it's virtual. So it is meant to be a little more intimate and to get your questions asked and answered. So always feel free to jump in or at the end share, and we can do questions and answers then. So closed captioning, let us know if you need that, and we'll set it up 10 days in advance of any events. And there is a list of our events. Let's move to the next slide about our outline. So I'm welcoming you right now, and then Bakari in a second will do the introductions. Then we'll have about a 10-15 minute presentation from our fantastic faculty, and then move into the question and answer. So again, feel free to just share your questions, or if you do put them in the chat as we go, Bakari can also monitor that and feed the questions at the end as well. So we're always happy to do that as well. We'll wrap up and share a little bit about next steps in our next events that are coming up. So that's where we're headed. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bakari, who will introduce our wonderful speakers.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pasque. So I'm going to begin by introducing Dr. Leslie Moore. Dr. Moore is an applied linguist and a linguistic anthropologist. Her research examines the social and cultural patterning of language and literacy development in communities whose members use multiple languages and participate in multiple schooling traditions. At UCLA, she earned a doctorate in applied linguistics and an MA in teaching English as a second language. In between graduate degrees, she was a visiting scholar in African languages and linguistics at Leiden University. After her graduate studies, she took a postdoctoral fellowship in the National Science Foundation Center for Informal Learning in Schools at UC Santa Cruz. Dr. Moore specializes in language socialization research, an ethnographic and interactional discourse analytic approach to the study of human development and learning. She has worked in Northern Cameroon since 1992 and has worked in the Somali community in Colombia since coming to OSU. Her research has been funded by the National Science Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the Spencer Foundation, and Fulbright. And Dr. Moore has recently completed her work as the principal investigator on an Ohio Humanities Council National Endowment for the Humanities Major Grant for K-12 education. She serves on the steering committee for the Buckeye Language Network, the executive committee for literacy studies at OSU, and the advisory board of OSU Center for African Studies. Her work has appeared in anthropological, linguistic, educational research, and interdisciplinary journals and in reference works, including Text and Talk, Social Analysis, Language Arts, Language and Communication, Studies in African Linguistics, the Handbook of Language Socialization, the Anthropology of Learning and Childhood, and Encyclopedia of Language and Education. Dr. Jackie Goodway received her PhD from Michigan State University. Her research agenda focuses on issues associated with the promotion of motor skill development and physical activity in young children who are at risk and or economically disadvantaged. To date, her work has shown that young children who are disadvantaged demonstrate substantial delays in fundamental motor skill development, and the communities in which they live have significant barriers to timely motor development and physical activity. She has implemented numerous motor skill interventions, demonstrating significant improvements in fundamental motor skill development for the children involved, as well as improvements in psychosocial factors associated with physical activity. Dr. Goodway has also found that contextual variables, such as family demographics, type and number of risk factors, and community and culture factors influence motor development. She has published two book chapters, 25 plus articles, 50 research abstracts, and has made over 100 presentations. Please help me welcome Dr. Jackie Goodway and Dr. Leslie Moore to our QualLab talk. Dr. Moore, I believe you could begin by sharing your screen.
Oh, screen share. I thought you had the slideshow.
I've got it.
You've got it. Okay. So thank you, Bakari, very much. And thank you,
problem.
Penny, for us being here. And I want to thank Jackie for being here because I brought her in. I had her in mind all along. And we actually, you know, she had to make this work scheduling wise, and Penny had to make it work scheduling wise. So she's like our special guest. One of the things that Jackie and I have in common is that we are both long-term IRB members. And Jackie, you stepped off last year?
Might be 2 years now.
2 years. And I can speak from my experience as a newbie to the IRB that Jackie was a great role model of how to be on the IRB, and very warm, very honest, very practical, very efficient, very much down to here's what really matters when you are reviewing an IRB and when you're creating an IRB. And when I found out from her that she had done some training sessions regarding IRB for our students, I said, ooh, you know, one, she shared the slideshows with me, and two, I thought, oh, she can do it with me as her lovely assistant. That would be fantastic. And really what we want to communicate about this session is that, yes, she's presenting these tips from the trenches, 10 tips for an IRB reviewer for the, you know, from an IRB reviewer for the successful IRB application, is to, you know, frame IRB applications in a couple of key ways. One, you are writing for the reviewer audience. They need to understand you. And I can't tell you how many applications I've read where clearly the writer does not understand that. And that's not shocking they don't understand, because this is a non-intuitive process, right? But our goal is to help to demystify the process. Number one thing is you got to realize you're writing for somebody else who does not know about you or your research. And this somebody else has a set of main concerns. And I joke about this, but I'll say it again. Our main concern is not to know how much you know about Vygotsky. It isn't. It really isn't. Our main concern is what you're doing, and is it ethical, and is it treating human subjects in the way that we expect you to. So that's one framing, this sort of practical, how to understand the genre, shall I say, of the IRB application. The other is to really remember and focus on the fact that IRB applications are not just hoops. They are, in fact, an opportunity for you to think through your research and dissemination plans with ethics in mind, with ethics in the forefront. And what a reviewer does, as much as anything, is they help you notice when there's an ethical issue that you haven't recognized yourself. And it is not strange that you don't recognize all the ethical issues yourself, because it is a complex, dense set of issues. But I would, again, say to you, please, if you come out of this session with anything, it's you're writing for an audience, and that audience has a very particular concerns, which Jackie is going to lay out really, really well for you all. And to think that these concerns all are about ethical research conduct, and that is how this IRB system was built, and that's what it's intended for. And think about it as an opportunity for focusing up on these questions and these issues in ways that maybe you wouldn't on your own. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Jackie.
And Leslie, jump in.
I will.
We can tag team back and forth. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted to be here. I served on the IRB for a decade, and just other responsibilities. I'm program chair right now and just couldn't manage the workload of the IRB. You definitely should be thanking anybody, any faculty member like Leslie who serves on the IRB, because it is an incredibly time-intensive service obligation. And so it takes a lot of time, but the one thing I love doing it, I learned a lot about research around the university, and I learned a lot about research and research ethics. So as we go through, Leslie and I were thinking we would kind of do a couple of slides And then we would take a pause and see if there's any questions or discussion around those slides. And then we'll do a couple more slides. There's only, I think, like 10 slides altogether. So as you submit your materials for IRB, and that one of my favorite words for my students is alignment. And I use that word not only for their IRB applications, but for writing any paper that they're writing or writing their dissertation. But one of the big pieces, like Leslie said, that quite often trips people up is there are multiple parts to this IRB application. So you have the online application itself, and there's a series of prompts that you need to respond to as you work through that IRB application. You have your consent forms that could be one, they could be three. So within consent forms, and we'll get to this a little bit later, you might have a parental consent form or a parental permission form. You might have an adult consent form, or you might have an assent form, which is for children who are under the age of 18. You're going to have a proposal that you will submit that you'll upload along with all of this other stuff. And you'll probably have a series of appendices, which will be things like all of your instrumentation. If you're doing qualitative research, it would be a list of questions for your interviews, those kinds of things.
Jackie, just quick note, in the system, they refer to the proposal as the protocol.
Yeah.
So just so you know
yes.
the language of it. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And so as an IRB reviewer, when we start looking at all these pieces, we start lining them up. And one of the biggest, I will say, as much as 70% of the proposals that I reviewed over the years did not line up, did not align. So in one place you say, I've got 100 children and 4 teachers, but then I go to your proposal and all of a sudden there are 8 teachers and 200 children. So just make sure that as you begin to upload stuff, that your method section that's in your online application is what you're saying in your protocol, which also matches your consent form and those kinds of things. So real common errors here would be like number of participants. We see big, when we're dealing with an intervention, so like say a teaching, a reading program, a language program, motor skill intervention like I do, we see lots of differences in descriptions of dose of the intervention. So we want to know things like time, how much time you're spending, frequency, how often, what's the total length of it, who gets what instrument and what procedure. I would say this last one on the bottom is a really, is an area where we see lots and lots of errors, where in one spot, it looks like a child's getting these 3 instruments, but in the consent form, you only mentioned 2, and then in the proposal, there's 5. So alignment is one of those, one of the big words I use for IRB. Leslie, anything else?
I mean, amen. This is a huge issue, and we've talked in the IRB with ORP, the Office of Responsible Research Practices, is one of the issues of how the application is structured in a literal sense. It actually acts against alignment in some ways, and so we are sympathetic to that. One of the things that I have been working with ORP about and is creating checklists. So essentially what Jackie just gave you was a three-point bullet points of common errors, but identifying common errors and then having a checklist to make sure people just go back throughout the entire thing and check certain things, because it is multi-part. And one of the things that we have to acknowledge is the complexity of the research that many of our faculty, staff, and students do. Extremely complex, mixed methods, research teams, multiple participant types. So it is not like you've set up an online survey that all your psych students are going to take, right? I love reviewing those. Because they're so easy. But the work that you all do, I love reviewing because I think it's so important and so rich. I'm not trying to diss the psych people, okay? But the point remains that we do in general do very complex research. And so it makes these issues of alignment even bigger for us than maybe several other fields.
Yep, absolutely. So the second piece is around the methods. And this is where it gets to be quite complex for us in the area of education, because what we're trying to figure out, what Leslie and I are trying to figure out as reviewers is, if we're talking, let's say we're talking about a reading intervention in a school. Reading is going on in that school classroom, regardless of whether we're doing research or not. So the pieces that we're trying to figure out is what's happening in the classroom as normal practice. And then what are you asking that teacher and those children to do that would be different from their normal practice? And a lot of times, once we get teachers to buy in to our research and maybe to our interventions, those do become part of normal practice for the classroom. So I think the research methods is the piece I go to first of all, and I try and go through and figure out what's going on, like who's getting what. So like, what are regular school activities? What are we bringing that would be different than before we showed up? A lot of times our intervention studies, for example, are very complex and there's multiple phases to them. So one of the phases might be, for example, you go in, you train the teacher on this new approach to doing something, and then you want to check if the teacher can actually do that. And then the teacher starts doing that in their classroom and you capture data. You might pre-test and then you capture data as they're delivering a program, and then you capture data at the end. What I would suggest to you that's really helpful for us is to break that down into phases. And, teacher training phase, and then describe it. Pre-test, I'm going to do all of these measures. And then delivery of the intervention, I'm going to do all of, this is what's going on with the intervention. Post-test, I'm going to do all of these kinds of things. As you get more complex, breaking it out into phases, into different components really helps the reviewer understand it. Make it easy to understand. Don't, like I will say, most of the time I read these things, and I'm sure Leslie does too, at 10 or 11 o'clock at night, because it's like, you've got it, the days are crazy. And so you're sitting there, and so huge blocks of text are rough. I much prefer it when there's a heading and some bullets or some short paragraphs, underlining things that are really important. And then being very precise about what are you doing? How many times are you doing it? When are you doing it? Where is it taking place? And who's getting it and who's giving it? So even in a qualitative study where you might be doing focus groups, like where is that focus group taking place? How many times are you going to do that focus group? Who's actually asking the questions? Who's responding in that focus group? How long is that focus group going? Is it a very precise set of questions, or is it much more interactive? So really helping us understand the methods is a critical piece to this, because if you don't have all the literature, I mean, most of the time we read this stuff, we don't even know, it's not our area. We don't necessarily know if you have all the literature. We don't really care about that. They ask you to give the literature. This is the piece that we're completely focused on, understanding what you're doing and whether what you're doing is ethical and follows federal guidelines for IRB. Leslie, jump in.
Well, I love bullets. I say to my students all the time, fear not the bullets list, yes. Right? And one of the things I think that has been clear to me in many of my reviews is, again, coming back to this complexity issue. If you are doing, Jackie's already indexed certain kinds of complexities of being in the classroom, and what's regular practice, what's happening because you're there. When you're doing action research, participatory action research, I've had many applications where people have, even though I know a lot about that kind of research, I have difficulty parsing out what's happening. And so there actually does need to be a lot of upfront work by the PIs and the co-Is, that they have explained the project in a way that is intelligible to someone who is not, one, already familiar with that particular research methodology, and two, not familiar with their project.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the things that we often, that's why I emphasize this idea of, remember, you're writing for an audience, you're not just submitting a form. And you really, you've got to do the work of making us understand. I can tell you things have happened where I've given my first round of requests for modifications, and it comes back, and then I'm like, oh, this is what you're doing. And then people get a new set of mods because now I actually know what they're doing. And then they're mad because I didn't give those mods the first time. And I get the frustration, but it does fundamentally come down to helping us understand what it is you're doing.
And avoid a lot of technical language to the extent that you can. I always say you're writing for your grandma. Your grandma should be able to read your, look at your proposal and read your method section and go, oh, I see what you're doing. If you're using a lot of fancy language, then it's tough. You've got to remember, these reviewers don't come from your field. So be very, very clear about it. So questions relative to these first couple of slides. I don't know if we have, I don't see the chat, so I don't know if we have anything in the chat. All right, so the beautiful consent process, and there's a lot to be discussed here. So consent is for adults only. So anyone who is not 18 cannot consent. Assent is for under 18s. And then any child who you want to have in your study has to have parental permission for the child to consent, or they consent to their child participating. So from an assent standpoint, I work with 3, 4, and 5-year-olds. The IRB would probably not make me assent these kids. Generally, they generally like to see assents starting around 3rd grade. But I ethically believe that children, we should treat all children with respect. And so I use a very simple assent process. So the kinds of work I do, kids come into the gym, they're going to go through a motor skill test. But as far as the kids are concerned, it's like playing in the gym with bats and balls. We videotape them, so we're making a movie. And so the kinds of assent language that we should use has to be at the level of the child that you're asking. So for my little munchkins, I say to them, hey, we're going to go in the gym and have some fun with our friends. We're going to play catch and run, and we're going to make a movie of that. And then I ask them, and I explain a little bit more, and I ask them, would you like to come play with me? And then there's a big, I generally have a happy face and a sad face. For the little guys, I keep it pretty simple. And if they point to the sad face, then they're not assented for that day. Well, try them again another day, because they could just be having a rough day. But generally, in the protocols I use, if I assent them twice and they point to the sad face both times, then they don't want to do it, and they shouldn't have to do it. So as we think about assent with children, we need to be careful of peer pressure. So when we do group assent, we need to talk about how we're not putting pressure on children to assent because all their friends are. When we deal with consent and parental permission, some of the big pieces are around each individual having time to be able to think about what you've told them in those consent forms, and then have a moment to have a little bit of time to walk away and go, do I really want to do this? So immediate consent is generally frowned upon. So sitting a group of teachers and telling them about your study and say, I want you all now to sign the consent form, we would call that a coercive environment. they should have, if they want to, that's fine, but you should say, you have an opportunity to take this home, reach out to me, ask more questions. So this process, both from a consent, an assent, and a parental permission standpoint, should not be in a coercive environment. There should be opportunity to ask questions, to take the form home and bring it back later. In terms of asking questions, they can only ask questions of the study team. And so you get into some issues here, and I think I might have it a little bit later, but where if you're working with a teacher who is part of your study, a parent, and they're not on your study team, they're not on your IRB, they haven't done the city training, they don't have the ECOI, they cannot ask questions about your study. They have to refer the parent to you. So only study personnel can really respond to questions. So you want to think about how do you enable that if you're working out in a school setting or a community setting. In a group consent environment, you just need to be aware of social pressure to consent. So typically with Assent, when I'm working in a school, I will Assent kids one at a time, and I'll just pull them off to the corner of the classroom, and then we just do it one at a time. Then there's a couple of different things that people always get wrong and get confused by. There's waiver of consent documentation. So what this means is you are consenting them, but they're not signing a form. And typically that occurs when the nature of the work you're doing could be picking up on some illicit, illegal behaviors, and you don't want to have their name on a particular IRB. Then there's waiver of consent, which means you're not even consenting them at all. I would say in the 10 years I was on IRB, I probably only saw a couple of instances where the IRB approved waiver of consent. And then there's alteration of consent, which is where you don't explain the study accurately ahead of time. So we see our psych folks, our psychology faculty do this a lot because they're looking at, they're putting you in a situation. If you understood the study, then it would influence their results. And so essentially the consent form doesn't really tell you a lot about the study, but then they're required if you agree to it, then after you've engaged in it, they're then required to go back and say, well, you were just in a study where we were looking at your response under pressure. We didn't want to tell you about it. Now that you understand the study, do you still consent to your data being kept? So there's all these different pieces to consent. Leslie, you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, alteration of consent is one of the ones that, well, waiver of consent documentation is interesting to me as someone who works often with immigrant community, and we have issues around documentation, legal status, and so it's one of the things where we often do seek a waiver of consent documentation is for children and families who may be concerned about being at risk for deportation. I mean, these are very serious matters, and we're in a really difficult situation at OSU because the federal rules for how you determine whether someone can waive consent documentation, they run into something with our Columbus City Schools policies for what they require signatures for. And they require signatures for things like photos and video. And so we have, one of the things that I would like us to get worked out is some kind of memorandum of understanding with CCS, where, because currently what happens now is our reviewers have taken different stances on this. My concern is getting hit by federal law that we're not following the law. And I think we need an MOU for that. So that's one thing that I think is, we want to think about. That is one of the reasons we waive consent. Essentially, it's these ideas of there's research that we do where the only thing linking the participant to the research is the consent documentation, and that puts them at risk in some way. Mm-hmm. Alteration of consent, where this has come up for me both as a reviewer and speaking with students, is that if people are coming into a study, particularly thinking of schools in particular, with a critical theoretical perspective, and they are asking questions in their research that they're aware that their research participants or potential research participants might not be happy if they knew those were the questions, and might not be willing to participate if they knew those were the questions. And it's a very difficult thing because we allow deception in very few cases. And so it is a complex matter because I do believe that the critical work needs done. But we are not engaged in long form journalism. We are engaged in research, and we do need to abide by certain rules. So those are kinds of issues where you're going to want to talk to your advisor and possibly ORP about how to deal with the fact that when you're writing up your consent form and you're telling people what your research is about, when you're asking them to participate, that you can be honest with them, treat them respectfully, and not set yourself up for everyone's going to run for the hills. So Jackie, thoughts on that? It's a really tough one, I think.
It is a tough one. And I would say if you do need to do alteration of consent, the OP staff are really helpful, and I would chat with them and have them look at your forms and have them do it. The other thing I say from a consent standpoint, I do a lot of work in underserved communities and with low levels of literacy. And our consent forms are federally driven. So you should use the consent template that is online. Don't go asking a faculty member for their consent forms. I mean, you can do that, but go to the consent template, because some of the faculty who they might give you an old consent form, it won't have all the elements that are required. But the way those consent forms are constructed is they're kind of terrifying for the average family. And so the other thing I've started doing is I quite often will attach a letter with my consent forms, like my parental permission forms particularly, that just that is way more friendly. Hi, my name's Jackie Goodway. I'm a professor at Ohio State. I'm really interested in how kids learn motor skills. And we're going to be doing a study. It's going to be really fun. Blah, de, blah. And it's much less, and, the form that you assign, we're required to put it in this way. I let them know. And so a lot of times the parents I talk to will say, oh yeah, I really like the letter. That other thing was like super scary, but the letter made me feel good, so I signed it. The other piece is on consent forms, and I don't know, I may have it on the next slide, I can't remember, is language-wise, you need to make sure your languages are they typically say somewhere around a 5th grade, 6th grade reading level is the way you should pitch your consent forms. If you are working in low literacy communities, then you may even write it at a simpler level. This is another example where big blocks of text are going to scare people off. Bullets, they like to see bullets. And they want to know, what are you doing if you're at the parental permission form, what are you doing to that kid? And who's going to be around when that happens? So be very clear on those consent forms. We're going to be asking them some questions about this, and then we're going to be videoing them, but they're going to be with 3 of their friends, and we'll be doing it in the hallway at a table. We'll do it in the corner of the classroom. So be very clear in these consent forms, particularly parental permission forms that are being taken home, just where things are happening and what's actually going to happen to their children. The other piece about the parental permission form that you're required to do is to indicate how long all of this is going to take. So I find it, rather than just say, this is going to take 2 hours and 35 minutes, I'll list the different elements of what I'm going to do. We're going to have a little group chat, and that's going to be 15 minutes. And then we're going to go to the gym, and we're going to play and do motor skills and do this. That's going to take about 30 minutes. So break things out for parents as well.
We have a question for you.
Go ahead.
Hi, Dr. Wen, Dr. Wei. I'm actually working on a project. Like my participants gonna be a group of high school students. So some of them are under 18 and some of them are above 18. So I'm kind of like struggling with the consent process. Like, does that mean like I have to have parent consent forms, participant consent forms, and assent? And what if like someone turning into 18 during the study process?
Ding, 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 yes. So check all of the above. So for your under 18s, you have to have a parental permission form. And then if those under 18s are going to turn 18, at the point that they turn 18, you then have to consent them as well. So they might start the study as a 17-year-old, and there needs to be a parental permission form and an assent form for them. But as they turn 18 in the middle of the study, you then have to consent them and they have to sign the adult consent form. And then like for any of the kids that will stay under 18, then all you need from them is the parental permission and the assent form. And working in that high school age group is like, particularly if you're a junior, seniors, and you've got kids who are turning 18, you've got to make sure you stay on top of that. So get kids' birthdays and figure, like date of birth, and figure out, you just need a list. And I like with my study team, we kind of set reminders in our calendar. Oh, Susie's turning 18 today. And so we just make sure that we go in, and at the point she turns 18, she can sign the adult form.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So like I said, use the online templates. It has all of the elements in it. I always add the friendly cover letter. Those templates are just super scary and they're quite intimidating for a lot of people. Use non-technical language. So I will say the one thing I was very sensitive to as a reviewer is I would read these consent forms written by some faculty member, highly theoretical, like scientists, and they kept on writing in their scientific way as they went to the consent forms. Like Leslie said, you gotta, for each of these pieces, you gotta think about who you're writing for. So now I'm writing a parental permission form. I need to take off my scientist hat and I need to think about, what if I were reading this for my kid? How would I feel? And just make sure that you keep it very simple. It's bulleted, it's easy to understand, it's easy to navigate. Parents
sorry, related to that, Jackie, it's probably a good idea, unless you write your proposals in really beautifully clear language, which very few scholars do, sadly enough. You probably should not copy and paste from your proposal into your consent form. Like it's almost guaranteed that's a bad idea. One, it will be the wrong level of language. It'll be too jargony, too specific, too discipline specific. And two, people always make this error of writing the consent form in a way that it doesn't actually address the reader. It doesn't say you or your child. And that's really important.
Yeah, exactly. So all your consent forms, like your parental permission, should say your child, or the assent form should say you, and they should be. So we're looking for: is it easy to understand? Is the language simple? And then be very precise. Like Leslie said, the biggest error is when people go cut, paste in their consent forms. I routinely would send back consent forms and say they're unacceptable, rewrite them. So be clear about with either with the procedures, like what are you asking me to do? How many times? Where's it taking place? What's happening? How long is it going to take? And again, here's where you will differentiate between typical practice and what's going on with research. A lot of times when we work in the classroom, particularly, a teacher will take on a new protocol, say a new reading, approach to reading, or a new motor skills. And so those kids who don't get consented, they're going to do those activities anyway. What you've worked with the teacher on will become normal practice. You want to put that into your consent form. So, and you also want to put that into your protocol. So what happens, say it's a reading intervention, what happens to those kids whose parents don't sign the consent form? Be very, very clear about that. The other piece is videotaping. Like a lot of times we videotape. Qualitative researchers a lot of times videotape. It's a great way to pull your field notes. So you have to be very clear in those consent forms what happens to those tapes afterwards. Who sees them? How, at the end of the study, do I destroy them? Now, for me in the motor skill world, we're really interested in movement, and the best way to see movement is see a video of it. And so I typically will have 3 boxes at the end of my consent form. The first box is, I agree to my kid being in this study. The second box says, I would like to use these videotapes in training teachers in my role as a faculty member in the university. So like sharing these videotapes with my undergrad students who I'm preparing to be teachers. So there's a box and so that I have some language that gives me permission to keep these tapes and use them in my university duties as an educator. And then the third box checks that says, I would like to use these tapes and show them at a professional conference as part of a scientific presentation. And so I quite often I will separate those 3 things out. I see some people make some rookie errors, and I generally will don't require it, but suggest that they do it, where they wrap everything into one. And they say, I want to, when you consent to this form, you consent to your child participating in the study, being videotaped, and me keeping all the videos at the end. I quite often will find parents who go, yeah, my kid can be in the study, but I don't want you to keep videos of them at the end. I want you to destroy them. If I wrapped it all in one, I would have lost that kid from my study, where in fact the parent was happy for them to do the study. They just don't want those videos hanging around over time. The way I wrote things, I will say most of my parents were happy to consent to all pieces of that. Leslie, I don't know how you do things in terms of your consent form.
Just replying to somebody's text about the issue of having a lot of consented kids in the class, but not all. And then how do you deal with that in terms of video, which is another thing. Videotaping, I think the multi-checkbox is a good one. I think it's very important, as Jackie was just articulating, without underlining, she was articulating this, is that when you are in your consent forms with parents or parental permission forms, you actually make intelligible for them what it means, what you're going to do with tapes. I see a lot of people saying these video recordings will only be used for academic purposes.
Yeah.
It's like, well, does that mean you're going to analyze the data? Does it mean you're going to present video in conferences? Does it mean you're going to put frame grabs in your publications? Does it mean you're going to put on a website for your department or your research lab? Like, and I don't know if people are alighting. I think most cases people are being elliptical unintentionally. I think that I have seen cases where I think people are quite intentional. They don't want the parents to know what they mean. And this is an ethical issue.
Yeah.
A major one. And I think a lot of scholars struggle with it because video has become such a big deal in so much research, and people want to be able to show the video. They want to have the frame grabs embedded in their transcripts. They want, and they are wanting to do whatever they can to make it possible to do that. And sometimes they walk the line really close in terms of sharing, getting actual like meaningful consent from participants. Informed consent means meaningful consent, meaning they know what you're asking of them. And a big part of what you're asking from Jackie is stressed the whole process. What's happening? What are they doing? How long does it take? There's also this whole thing of what happens with the data you have collected from them.
Yeah.
Huge, 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 huge. hopefully in our next ORIC newsletter, or I guess Kim Lytle puts it out, we're going to have a bit from IRB about issues around identifiable data and video as identifiable data. People tend to think about identifiable data is like your name, your social security. Well, your face is identifiable. And
a lot of people make that error in their applications. There's a box you're supposed to check that says identifiable data, and you need to check it with video. In terms of videoing the classroom and with kids who are not consented, you're going to have to be very creative about the way you position your camera, and having particular kids in one area where you're not picking up on kids. But I will tell you that no matter how good you are at that, it will go wrong on at least one session. So for example, I video in the gym, you know, some kids, I've got a group of kids who weren't consented or working in this corner of the gym, video's not aimed there, but a ball rolls out of their hands and they go chasing it, and all of a sudden they come running across my camera. So you can deal with that with video where you can black them out. But again, you would, a lot of times the reviewers will say, well, yeah, I like your plan, but it's probably going to fail at some point. So what are you going to do when it fails? Are you going to destroy that video? Or are you going, you know, how are you going to manage those kinds of things? What time do we have till, like noon? Is it a 1? Okay, so child assent, I think we've really talked about this. Always get this right. You don't assent a child first. You have to get parental permission before you assent a child. Make sure it's in language that the child can understand. They either sign it if they're old enough, or they might point to a smiley face or a sad face like I do, and then I just circle it. Be aware of coercion in a group environment. And most of the time, upper elementary, we would expect you to begin to assent children, but I personally do it with, I think you can do it as young as, you know, sort of 3-4 years of age. So the other piece we've talked about, engaged or not. And so this becomes a huge issue, particularly in school-based work, but even any community-based work as well. So anyone who's on your study team has to go through city training, has to fill out the ECOI. They actually have to do that responsible research practice. So anyone on the study team can be engaged, can answer questions, can recruit people, can hand out consent forms, collect assent forms, and sign off. A lot of times we partner with, say, teachers in the schools, and they're part of our study, and they actually are probably a participant in our study, and they've signed a consent form. They are not part of the study team. It used to be, this was one thing I slowly changed over the decade I was on IRB. We used to have absolutely ridiculous procedures around this. So now the IRB is settled on the fact that you can give a teacher some consent forms, and the teacher can hand them out to the kids, and they can put them in their folders and take that parental permission form home. They can actually gather them back and stick them in an envelope that as you circle around and pick them up, that would be fine. So they're just a conduit in managing paper flow. They can help you manage paper flow, but that's as far as it goes. They can't recruit kids, so they should not be saying things like, oh, you should do this study. It's really cool. We're going to have a lot of fun when we do this study. And if you do the study, you get a pencil. They have that would be seen as recruiting. They can't recruit. They are not part of your study team. They can't answer questions about things. So you have to talk, if you're going to involve community or community folks or teachers who are not on your study team, you have to say what they're going to do for you, and you have to talk about how you're going to manage that whole situation. How are you going to deal with questions? You know, if a parent picks up a kid from the classroom and says, Mrs. Smith, can you tell me about this study? Mrs. Smith is going to should be able to say, no, I can't tell you about this study, but here's this person's number, or here's this person's email, or the email and number are on the form. Please reach out to them. They'd be happy to talk to you. So that's where people begin to get into trouble, when we see non-engaged people who are not on your study team beginning to get involved in the actual research process. It's rarely deliberate. It's typically very enthusiastic, kind, supportive teachers and community members who love you and want to help you, and then they end up doing something that they shouldn't do. Leslie, jump in.
That's a big one. And I know for lots of people, it's real frustrating because exactly as you said, Jackie, you've got folks who are supportive of the work you're doing, and they can play a key role in recruitment. But the rules are that there are rules for engagement about this. So and I've seen a lot of event reports related to this issue.
Yeah. So if this gets screwed up for you, which it quite regularly could, you need to file what's called an event report. And so essentially it's just saying, hey, I confess, we had this approach, but this teacher got really enthusiastic, and in our parent conferences that night, advertised the study and told everybody they should participate. That event report then comes to the IRB. There's a discussion of the event report. If needed, the PI is asked to come to meet with the IRB. 9 times out of 10, if it's not deliberate and it's not systematic, we don't see it over and over again. The IRB just sort of sign off on it and talk to you a little bit about managing that a little bit better next time. So videoing, I think we've already gone through all of this. You need to have video. It's an identifier, so it's not de-identified information. And I think I've already talked about the boxes.
Jackie, one question that came up in the chat was about, so what happens if you're videoing and one of your non-participants comes into the frame, right? And in my experience with IRB around this is that, this happens. We know this happens. You have to make a good faith effort to minimize that happening. And then when it does happen, if you have those kinds of consents where people said you can present my video data, like you can't present that segment.
Yes, exactly.
And if the kid is, you cannot use that kid's conduct while they're on camera as data. You cannot transcribe their talk. You cannot just, map out their movements. So essentially they have to function as being invisible to you as a researcher. But we understand that even the best efforts, this happens. And, so yes, excellent question, by the way.
Yeah, and it's always better where you acknowledge that in your protocol, saying, I know, this is our approach to trying to minimize that. But if this were to happen, here's how we would manage our data. This data would not be this video would not be presented publicly. We would black out the kid using technology and just sort of speak through how you would deal with it.
And critically, it's not, they cannot be data sources for you. Those kids cannot be data sources for you.
Correct.
Yeah,
absolutely. So I think we talked through that. Incentives. So a lot of times we use incentives. If you have a grant, those incentives can be, gift cards. They can be, with my little kids, we give them like my munchkins. If they bring home, if they bring their parental consent form back, they get a pencil, or they get one of those little rubber wristbands with something fun on it. The things we're looking at for incentives are, they can't be coercive. And coercive is population specific. So if you're working in a lower income neighborhood and you're going to give every kid a $300 gift card, that would be considered coercive. If you were working with a group of cancer doctors and you wanted them to fill out a form and you were going to give them a $300 gift card, that would be considered fairly basic practice. So understand that the incentives are very much based on the population specific. You also need to, from an incentive standpoint, you need to talk about the different phases of your study. So the pieces that a lot of people get wrong is they say, okay, I'm going to give kids, they're going to get a $50 gift card at the completion of the study. But our question then is, well, what if they just do the pre-test and they start the intervention and they don't post-test? So you have to prorate your incentive. So it's actually better to say, of those $50, you're going to get $10 for the pre-test, $30 for the intervention, or if it's a longer intervention, $15 for the first X weeks, and then $15 for the next X weeks, another $10 for the post-test. So break out your incentives, be really clear about who gets them. And then if you do end up using gift cards, you need to talk to your fiscal officer in your department, because there are very, very specific protocols about managing gift cards and getting things signed. And there's a particular form that we use. Leslie, incentives, anything on that?
Yeah, incentives that, oh, sorry, did I?
Nope, you're on mute.
Sorry. Can you hear me now? Yay, all right. Yeah, the managing your incentives properly from a bookkeeping perspective, super duper important. That's a big deal right now, for a good reason. There's been lots of abuse in that space.
Yeah.
And the issue of incentive being the prorating, the scheduling of the incentives. I've seen applications where people have tried to say, well, if I give them money along the way, they won't participate. And I'm like, well, then you have to give me a really good argument for why it's absolutely critical that they participate through various stages, for that to be a justifiable incentive schedule. And I do think we've had arguments in IRB around what are appropriate incentives. Yeah. I can say one of our colleagues really went to bat about, hey, doing these lotteries with kids who don't understand the probabilities, perhaps. And they're, it can get pretty borderline sometimes, in fact. So yes, thinking carefully about this. We could someday do a whole session on incentives.
Yeah. and again, reach out to an advisor, talk to the ops staff. They have a pretty good handle on this and can help advise you. I know we're kind of short on time. So confidentiality, obviously participant numbers, pseudonyms. Some people, it's very hard to, when you're out in schools and you've got lots of paper forms and there's only participant numbers on there, that's tough. And you see people write in pencil, Susie Q's name. You can't do that. You're just going to have separate list of participant numbers and names and keep them apart. So just make sure that you don't end up with any kinds of forms with people's names on them, other than the consent form. You can't ensure confidentiality in a group interview. And so the specific language that needs to be used on your consent forms and in your protocol. And then I think the other piece is demographic data may predispose somebody to not being, it could be, I don't know, it could be about like race or ethnicity in a largely white school, or so just be sensitive to those kinds of things. And then the other piece, and Leslie, I don't know where they've gone with this since I've stepped off, but a lot of people now are using these commercial transcriptions. So it's like, and so you send your audio to a company and they will transcribe it for you. Yeah. We used to require that you would put that in your protocol. Are we still requiring that? Yeah, we do. We do require that. Yeah. And so sometimes people, that's something that often gets added later, like somebody suddenly has some money and they can pay, you need to add it. Yeah. Yeah. You can't just, if you don't put it in your protocol, you can't just send your transcription off to a commercial entity and have them do it. Because those people are not part of your study team. and they're seeing study data, and it's okay, but it needs to be approved by the IRB. If it's not approved by the IRB, it's a violation of IRB.
Well, we've got 1 minute. So what I want to do is to make sure that people know they can stick around for the last little follow-up. That way, just like if we were all in person, you could stand in line, and talk to the presenters, and if they have time, they will be happy to do that, because I know we didn't get to the Q&A. I do want to invite you to attend the QualLab events. We have the Unapologetic series where we've had between 500 and 800 people come for those series. We have our resources that we posted here in the chat during, and also QualLab lunches. The next one is about grants, and we have another one about in vivo, how to use in vivo, by Rhodesia McMillan, who's one of our equity postdocs. So with that, I want to be conscious of time and thank our presenters, please. Thank you very much. And then ask you to stick around if you have questions, and also let people go if you don't. So thank you so much for taking the time. We're so glad you're here, and hope to see you next time.
Thank you all for coming and
Thanks,
taking an
yes.
interest in the issues.
Yes.
Yeah, and I'm happy to